Hello, welcome to The Confident Commit, the podcast for anyone who wants to join the conversation on how to deliver software better and faster.
If you're looking to build a trusted ship, tune in, let's confidently commit.
I'm your host, Rob Zuber, CTO of CircleCI, the industry leader in all things CI and CD. Today, I'm joined by Brian Guthrie, Director of Engineering at JustWorks. Brian, so glad to see you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to see you as well. It's been a little while.
Yeah. So I was going to give just a quick intro and then I'll, obviously mostly ask you a lot of questions, but we met a couple years ago now in San Francisco at a CTO summit. And then a funny thing happened the other day where someone posted an article in our, internal Slack and was like, hey, you should check this out. It came across my feed on I think it was in a newsletter or something. So congrats on getting into a newsletter. And I was like, oh, hey, it's Brian. Like I haven't spoken to him in a while. What a fun, opportunity that would be to have you on the show. Because every time we've spoken, I feel like, you always say something, not to put too much pressure here, but you always say something that leaves me thinking like, oh, that's really interesting. I never thought about it that way before. And so, I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of you, but also a huge fan of like having people around you who don't just like, it's kind of like the anti-devil's advocate in a way, right? Like that's I'll just oppose you because I want to oppose you, but rather like, oh, wait, I hadn't actually looked at it from that angle. And now I have a new piece of perspective that's maybe going to change my view a little bit. And I just think that's super important. So to kick things off, I was trying to write down some notes for the show. And the thing that came to my mind was like, how did you get so opinionated? But I mean that in the nicest possible way. Like, can you tell me a little bit about a time or two where you're just like, I feel like if we really dug into this and questioned what we were doing, we'd be able to do better, right? Like break out of the status quo. People are accepting what we're doing, but I'm pretty sure we're smarter than that. We're better than that. Like, are there sort of like some defining moments that you can think of that are like that, where you really started to, to think more deeply and critically about what things were going on?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. Well, I want to say thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm a huge fan of CircleCI. It's obviously, one of the most important tools out there for helping developers everywhere ship faster, ship more effectively. I love the new features you've been building. I saw the MCP server for getting folks wired in on Cursor. That's good stuff. And so it's fun to come in and talk about this stuff. I would say that the journey for me really starts with ThoughtWorks back in the day. I joined back in 2007, part of the cult of Martin Fowler, and a really opinionated group of folks themselves, right? And so they kind of nudge you into being opinionated to some degree. That's part of what their brand was originally built on, is they encourage you to come in and take a sharper look at how clients were engaging and building software. And over the years, I left a long time ago. It's been more than a decade since I worked there. But over the years, I've become really into this idea of what was it about that place and their attitude and their approach that made it work? What was it that made it feel like we truly were, I hope, helping our clients improve how they were delivering software and moving more effectively? And there's a laundry list of stuff that they didn't necessarily invent, but I do truly think that they were instrumental in articulating or bringing to the industry or trying to encourage folks towards the use of. And that's sort of where my interest in moving faster goes, because none of those teams were out there hustling. Like this wasn't an 80-hour-a-week culture thing. And yet nonetheless, they would kind of wander into a bank or an insurance company or something and just chew through those teams, not necessarily because they were burning the hours or because their engineers were head and shoulders above everyone else, but truly because I think they thought really carefully about what it means to deliver software quickly. What does it mean to get something out the door and into the hands of customers? And how does that alter how you approach your software development lifecycle? If you had to go back and rebuild that culture, that process from scratch, my thesis here, I guess, is that you would start with this question of like, how do we shorten the time between when you start working on something and when it gets shipped out? And you truly treat that as a first-class consideration in your software lifecycle process, right? It's not ancillary. One of the most important questions really is, what is your lead time from conception to production? And then how fast do you know whether or not it's working? And I over the years, my observation has been that conversation can sometimes feel sidelined by other considerations. And one of the things that I think made those teams doing sort of XP style work so effective is that they had no chill for that stuff, that they would come in and try to deconstruct process and really try to understand what are the pieces that you can preserve in the name of safety and effectiveness, and what are the pieces that you can tear apart and pull away in the interests of moving out faster. And so that was really sort of the origin point for me. And it's something I've been trying to articulate for the teams that I lead and the folks that I work with. And I tried to set it down finally in a place where I felt like I could point people to that and say, like, that's what we're doing. Please think about it in those terms. And I'm into this idea of how do you take that management philosophy, the attitude to how you're leading teams and articulating in a way that brings people along for the ride. And that was really my hope in trying to write a little bit more about the process side.
Yeah, and to clarify for listeners, the article that was shared with me was this Move Faster Manifesto. And so one of the things that really hit home out of that post was that you kind of have to have lived it to love it, right? And if you've done it, right? If you've lived in that world, sort of as you're saying, like we're coming in from the outside and looking at places and being like, do y'all know that it's possible to deliver software quickly, right? Like, and it's actually super fun. And when you've done it, you're never going to want to go back. But how do you get people to take that leap of faith, or to like say, okay, I'm going to do some things that are really uncomfortable in the name of a goal that I don't really believe is possible, so that when you get them there, they'll go, oh my gosh, this is actually amazing, right? Like, what do you have any tricks? Like, I don't know, how do you get people over that hump, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I wish I had a magic wand answer to this, and I don't think I do. I hope someone does. I'd love to hear about it, but I think that part of it is to simply explain that it's possible. You simply have to sort of paint a picture of the world that says, like, look, one of the articles I love about this has nothing to do with software at all, but it's written by a software process consultant talking about how the Empire State Building was constructed. And I'll share it out later. But the Empire State Building, incredibly, was constructed in, I think, 13 months, right? And this thing occupies an entire city block. And simply to get the industrial materials in place to get this thing built from beginning to end took round-the-clock truck deliveries to Midtown Manhattan in the 30s, just hour after hour after hour. And the takeaway from the article is that it starts with a set of business constraints and works backwards from there. So rather than starting with like, well, let's build this thing and see how fast we're moving, and we'll build a burn-up chart, and we'll figure out maybe when it's going to ship. You start with a very concrete business constraint, which is we have a very specific contract that says that we have to get this thing built in a year. We have a set of floors that we have to go build. Let's figure out what has to happen from a workflow standpoint in order to get the thing up. And this really dovetails with a lot of other, I think, contemporaneous conversations on how do we as a society get a little bit unstuck. For those of you who've been following sort of the abundance stuff and Derek Thompson, Eric Klein talking about, or Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talking about how to build a government that is capable in a virtuous and hopefully helpful way of executing more quickly. What does it mean to talk about outcomes a little bit more? What does it mean to think about what it takes to build something quickly? And so I think step one is simply articulating to people that it's possible. Companies move fast all the time when they need to, but it really requires first a demonstration that it is possible to do. And then secondarily, you have to have a conviction that it's necessary. Someone involved in the process has to be able to articulate that, hey, actually, fast really matters. Fast is not a secondary consideration. Sometimes it feels like unhip or like ancillary to talk about moving quickly. And I think people get nervous when the topic comes up, because when they hear we have to have a sense of urgency or we have to move faster for management, it feels like the batons are about to come out and they're going to whack people until the midnight oil gets burnt. And I don't think that's the vibe that I'm going for at any rate. And I don't think it's actually the vibe that works best. I think you look really hard at what the workflow steps are that are getting you out into prod, and then ask yourself, which pieces of this do I have to kick out or remove in order to streamline beginning to end? But it really takes, I think, on some level, the marriage of a leadership conviction that you have to move fast and the ability to articulate for people what that can look like and how to bring them along for the ride.
So what I didn't hear in there at any point was, I mean, you talked about lead time as a thing that you should be obsessed with, but sort of like DORA metrics and developer productivity evaluation. And maybe I'm trying to play back what you're saying. Though that's sort of looking at it from a incremental improvement here and there, but without the conviction, without the belief that we will all be in a better place if we move fast. All of that stuff is sort of fringe, right? Because you'll tweak some things here and there, but if people aren't bought in, none of it matters.
Yeah, I mean, I like the DORA metrics, right? I think it's important work. I huge respect to Jez Humble and Dr. Nicole Forsgren for driving that stuff. But I think where I run into trouble with it is that, especially for those of us who are working in more tech forward firms, like I'm sure for everyone at your firm, you're probably on the leading edge of all of those metrics. And past a certain point, it feels neither necessary nor sufficient. You can have a really high performing team and still struggle in the market, and you can do spectacularly in the market and have a team that isn't necessarily leading edge. Although, of course, the premise of the research is that all else being equal, teams that move faster as measured by those metrics do better. But I guess what I'm trying to get at with looking at the lead time piece is that it's sort of a probabilistic approach for thinking about how to move a business forward using software. The premise is sort of all else being equal, the more frequently you put stuff in front of customers, the more hits you're going to get. Not every feature you ship is going to be a hit. Not everything's going to work. Not everything's going to make it out in a way that moves the business forward. And there are two ways really to maneuver your way out of that and grow faster. One is to improve the hit rate of the things that you're shipping. And the second is simply to ship more often, in the belief that all else being equal, the more at-bats you have, the more stuff is going to produce a commercial outcome, right? And I think that we get really wound up, I think, on the process side, sometimes in the former conception that really what we have to do is study deeply and think really hard about it. And like, we really want to make sure that when this thing launches, it's going to hit. And for some businesses, that works spectacularly, right? I sort of think of that as the Apple model, right? Well, they'll chew on a thing forever until it's really ready to go. And when it hits pretty hard. But for a lot of us who are out there, building SaaS applications or shipping continuously into production in sort of a startup sense, a viable path to business success really is getting stuff out more often, measuring what's working, classic lean startup stuff, and then turning around new features on the basis of what you learn.
Right. And I think very much to your point, you talk about shipping more in order to increase the total number of hits, assuming the same ratio, right? I think another thing that we get hung up on, and this is like, I think from a DORA perspective or other developer metrics, it's often the best we can do, which is that we delivered a PR, right? But if my hit rate is just the same piece of work broken into smaller pieces, that reduces risk. There's other reasons for small batch sizes, but I'm not actually spreading my bets, right? I'm just adding increments of the same bet, which I think when you're saying, I want to increase shipping, you're talking about more experiments, more small bets. I was going to say more smaller, but there's a comma in between, like a larger number of bets, which happen to be smaller, to therefore explore the space and get better information to then make bigger bets when you've started to hone in on what's really going to matter.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, and good call out there. I do think it's valuable and helpful to have small atomic PRs, right? It's good to ship incrementally. Thank goodness there are phenomenal tools out there in the market for helping developers do that more effectively. Not to name any names on this podcast, but I do think that the important thing to think about when you're zooming out and thinking about it from sort of a delivery or a business growth standpoint is like, what is that atomic unit of user-facing value, and how quickly are you able to conceptualize it and bring it to a place where you feel like you can get some sense of whether or not it's working, and then act on the basis of what you've learned and turn that around. And I think it's a very tractable proposition, even for businesses that have more sales-led models or are working in a slightly more conservative industry. Your lead times might not be the same as they would if you're sort of more on the bleeding edge of SaaS or a consumer app or something. But there's nonetheless ways of setting targets or expectations around how frequently you ship that help you constrain those bets. I mean, the other thing you're trying to avoid is like, it's very easy because it is difficult for us to estimate software, right? Classically, it's difficult to figure out how long it's going to take to build something. It's very easy, or at least certainly I've gotten into situations where you prioritize something and it takes way more time and effort than you're expecting. And by the time you've shipped the thing, any ROI that you might have had associated with it is sort of blown past you, right? It's the juice was almost by definition not worth the squeeze. And so I think it's really important to sort of work back from that conception of like, sort of like the Empire State Building example. What's the business constraint that we're operating inside? What's a meaningful thing that we can do inside that business constraint? What kinds of scope conversations and delivery speed conversations do we have to have in order to operate within those constraints? And then how do we rally the team around that idea and turn deadlines from something that feels scary into something that really provide ideally sort of virtuous and useful guidance in a way that helps us figure out how we're going to get this stuff out, and then pull those back until we can get them to sort of the tightest possible time that we can. And again, not by wandering around and asking people for weekend work or doing the grind or whatever, right? But like really doing the hard SDLC work of like sizing and scoping and negotiating over scope and pushing back and sizing up and whatever, right? Like really getting persnickety about this stuff, I think.
Yeah, I think deadline is such a fascinating word, right? And people are really comfortable with, I don't know if everyone's really comfortable, but I'll say generally with the word time box.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That feels like a concept that I have some agency over.
Yeah.
Versus a deadline, which is like everything has to be fit into this period of time and there's no discussing the everything. Right. And I don't know that that's actually true, but I think people have these mental associations with words like that. And to your point of like figuring out the scope, like to me, it's let's figure out what we're trying to learn, right? If we're really talking about placing a bunch of bets and we're probably going to be wrong, like what's the thing we're trying to learn and what's the smallest amount of effort that we can put in to learn that thing? Let's start from there. If we're super confident and we're trying to get something to scale to 100 million users or whatever you have, cool. Like we might just have to do the work, right? But if we're still in this, like finding the space, learning about it, getting information, then it's not, here's the project, try to cram it into this deadline, but rather, hey, everybody, like this is what we're trying to learn. Here's some ideas about how we might try to learn it. And I think that's where like bringing more people into that makes it at least more comfortable. And you know, and
I can tell
you're
better at this than I am.
No, I practice talking about it publicly. I mean, everyone can talk about this stuff better than they can actually do it, right? But I think it's like that's a real heart of the problem is that not necessarily everyone feels that, you know, that level of trust and connection in their organization, the teams they're on or whatever to say, what if we went about it this other way? Right. And so I think that that's what you're hitting at there though, like that, let's put it in a box, right? And figure out what we can do in the time that we have. Because if it's not, to your point on the ROI, which I think is a fantastic point, when it becomes, let's deliver this at all costs, you know, the cost keeps going up, but the return is actually, it's not even staying the same. It's going down usually, right? Because you have cost of delay. And so it's taking longer and longer to get out there. Now the opportunity cost feels worse. Like everything kind of degrades really quickly. And it's sort of working those absolutes that I think really, really hurts us. And I think another thing that you commented on a couple times around the Empire State Building, and if anyone listening to this lives in the East Bay, my favorite example, oh gosh, this was like 15 years ago, maybe, there was a truck fire on the 580 and a section of a highway was melted because the truck, it was like a tanker truck that melted the section above it, right? Because it was in this overpass or whatever. So an entire section of like a core artery of traffic in the Bay Area melted overnight. Like concrete was gone, the rebar, everything just gone.
Oh my goodness.
And yeah, right. And everyone woke up in the morning and said, it's going to be 3 years before like we can drive again. And I think it took 4 weeks or something to find the contractor. Like this, we're talking about government operations, right? And exactly to your point, like people can move fast when they need to. And I think that in the book Switch, the Heath brothers talk about finding the bright spots, right? Like where are things working? And that notion of like, we know we can do this. You probably have it in your own organization somewhere. You can point to a place and say, under these conditions, with this level of clarity and purpose and whatever, we totally did this. How do we do more of that? And you can find the things in your organization that really start to, oh, wait, no, we do know how to do that. It's not all hopeless. It's just that we fall back into this kind of default position of going a little more slowly. So how do we replicate that? What were the conditions that allowed us to be great? Let's replicate those conditions and be great more often. I think is, maybe gives people some hope.
Yeah.
So one other thing, which I'm not sure is totally related, but another thing that I found because I was reading an article and I went and read, some other stuff on your site. I think you reposted something that you had shared previously around feature branching considered harmful. And I was curious if there was something currently, like when you said, oh, I really need to put this back out in the world and make sure that everyone reads it again. Like, is there something that you're seeing as a pattern right now that really drew you to kind of rethink that, refresh that, get that content back out into the world?
Gosh, I'm glad you asked. What a great segue. So to me, I think it's actually very relevant to the topic of how to move faster. So I think a lot about, one of the things that kills lead time is context transfer, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think in engineering leadership, one of the things I think a lot about is the balance between synchronous and asynchronous workflows. And feature branches and pull requests are a fundamentally more asynchronous workflow. I'm old enough. I'm 42, and I'm old enough to remember what it was like before Git and what it was like before pull requests. The dark times when branching did not work especially well, and most of the VCS software out there wasn't really a friend when it came to allowing more autonomous movement in software teams. And teams, I'm curious to hear about your experience as well, but my sense of that at the time is that teams adapted in one of two ways. Either they really went hard into sort of the early generation of VCS tools that attempted to be slightly better at asynchronous workflows and branches and suffered through it, or there was a branch of software engineering process that really embraced the idea of walking away from branches and working much more close to trunk, is what we called it in some version back in the day, right? Mm-hmm. And that was for me, the way I experienced that early in my career was on teams that practiced extreme programming. And in extreme programming, you don't typically work in an asynchronous fashion. You're gathering, 8 to 12 engineers physically in a room. You're pair programming on every single line of code that runs into production. You're running the tests synchronously, and then you're pushing, 10 times a day sometimes, right? Like you're just continuously shifting your changes back up into production. And that really was the original definition of continuous integration. Continuous integration didn't mean there's a server somewhere running your tests. Continuous integration described a workflow, a process. Mm-hmm. It was the idea that teams should be merging all changes back into mainline at least once a day. And if you are pair programming and working synchronously, then you get all of the benefits of peer review, right? You get all of the standard benefits of having someone else who has context on the work that you're doing that's reviewing you continuously, but you're tightening the feedback loop around that, right? You're bouncing context back and forth all the time. You're swapping architecture discussions continuously. It's just what makes it extreme is not the hours. What makes it extreme is that you are just continuously, intensely collaborating in a way that ensures that things always get back into prod. And measured in wall clock time, measured in lead time, my belief, my argument, my perception from those teams is that those teams often moved faster than teams do today because they are not working through the lead time cost of an asynchronous review, right? You open up a pull request, you spin it out into the world, you say, hey, could someone please review this? Maybe it takes a day or two, someone turns around, gives you a review, leaves some comments. In the meantime, you've moved off to another story or ticket, and so you move back to the thing, and then you make some changes, and you submit them, and someone else peer reviews them, and then eventually get it out into prod, right? But even though you've been busy the entire time, measured in terms of wall clock time, it's a much slower process. It's mm-hmm. literally more expensive as perceived by an outside observer, even though the asynchronous process is easier in some ways. It's a little bit more convenient. You're not bumping elbows as frequently or as aggressively. You're building a process that is, just easier to coordinate in many senses. One of the things that makes XP so challenging is that everyone has to show up at the same time every day, and everyone's got to take lunch at the same time. If you're holding to this idea that everyone has to pair in every single change, it gets awfully difficult awfully quickly. And as the world has become more distributed, more asynchronous, it's just become a very difficult proposition. But pull requests were originally built for teams in the open source worlds that were presumptively following that model. And so for those of us who weren't using heavy branching models prior to the introduction of Git and then later GitHub, we sort of looked at pull requests and we're like, well, why would we want them, right? That was our initial reaction at many of the ThoughtWorks teams, is this doesn't solve a problem that we have. We're pairing all the time, right. We're shipping all the time. Like, this doesn't really buy us much. And so I was slow to understand that the industry was shifting in that direction. I think I wrote this in 2017 originally and ranted about it. And I'd started to go out into teams and discover that this is just the way that things had started to work. And I was saying, look, wait a second. This is a process that was built for open source asynchronous projects that are necessarily lower trust, more decoupled. It's more difficult to coordinate. But if you're working in an enterprise where you have the benefit of synchronous coordination, then you might as well lean into it and get the benefits of that working model instead of moving everyone over to an asynchronous pull request model. And I lost the debate. That hasn't been the way that the industry has panned out.
You against the industry?
Turns out you can't really.
Well, the reality of that is you can choose your own space, right? Like, many of us would like the whole world to follow the patterns that we believe in, but at the same time, as long as we're enjoying what we're doing and successful at it, maybe that's winning if your competitors are following a different pattern, right? But I do think, like, I was like going over I can't even remember all the different source control systems that I've used in my career, right? And like the early ones, you locked files. Like, I'm working on this file now and no one else can work on it until I put it back. The nice thing about that is people would start screaming at you if you took more than a couple hours, right? Like, hey, why you still have that file? I got some work to do, maybe that would be a fun way to go back to it. So I would say, like, when I think about the problems that are being solved in pair programming, like I've not worked in a, environment that was sort of as pure as ThoughtWorks from a pairing perspective, but in all of the smaller organizations that I've built or worked in or whatever over the years, and in what I would call really effective teams, there was always that shared context. We might not be working on the same thing right now, but we're working close enough to each other that when you send me the change or you say, hey, can you pop over and take a look at this? I'd be like, yep. Oh, hey, why don't you try this over here? Okay, cool. Let me know when you're done. I'll take another look and we'll push it, right? Yeah. Versus, I think what has happened is hey, I did this thing. And you're like, what was that for? Let me go read the JIRA ticket and try to understand the context of the thing you're working on, even though you're on my team of 4 people or whatever. And then try to read your PR and make sense of it. And because it's going to take me a day or two to read it, you wrote a bigger PR. Because if that turnaround time is high, then I'll get more work through on that turnaround. And now my time to like read it and understand it gets bigger, right? So it's like this negative feedback loop. And there's something I've been thinking about. I haven't thought about it in this context, but I would say in Agile, if you grew up with Waterfall and you witnessed the like revolution for you of, wait, we can just ship stuff when we're done, right? We can do Kanban and we don't even wait for the 2-week sprint cycle or whatever. We just put stuff in production, right? Continuous deployment, whatever. You never go back. You're like, oh my gosh, this is the greatest thing. Look at how fast I can deliver. But if you never experience that and you start doing Kanban, you can interpret that as it doesn't have to get done today because I could ship it tomorrow, right? And like you almost get this inverse effect of having not struggled with the pain of kind of how it used to be. So like, I'll be the old man yelling at clouds. And so it's kind of the same, like PRs, I agree. They're almost a wall to prevent people from merging, right? Like people put stuff into open source projects that the maintainers are just like, I'm never going to look at that. Yeah. So you need, like, if you just gave everyone in the world, access to merge direct to mainline, be like, just do some, branch by abstraction. We'll all be fine. Like, that would be terrifying. But is that how we want to operate internally inside of an organization? No, I don't think so. But But because that's just how people are used to working, right? At some point, you're just like, oh, that's what we do. Like, it takes time. It takes time to get people up to speed. This is just the process. Kind of going all the way back to like, if, on the speed thing, once you felt it, once you've experienced it, you're like, I'm never letting this go.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I never want to go back to that thing where I wait 2 days for someone to review my PR. Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's by the time they give me feedback, I'm like, oh, what was I working on again? I've already moved on to this other project.
And the good news is that suggests almost immediately like a path forward for teams that do want to move fast, which is just, instead of leaning into the asynchronous model, swivel your chair around, Slack someone, whatever, tap someone on the shoulder and say, hey, could you go take a look at this, please? And then set some sharp expectations for your team around what a fast review cycle looks like. There's lots to be said for PRs from sort of an auditability standpoint. And as an atomic unit of review, they're super handy. But you can move towards a more fast process by sort of leaning into that idea of actually, no, we are going to context switch in and out of delivery and review all the time. And the cost that we're going to pay for that context switching is lower than the cost we're going to pay by moving into a fully asynchronous model, maybe, right? But if you wanted to bring in that element of it, you just lean out of the async and lead into the synchronous piece and just say, no, we're going to treat each thing as with some immediacy when it comes to reviewing it.
Yeah.
And likewise, from a planning standpoint, it can be very tempting on a sort of the team level to shard your work into individual pieces and say, you are the person driving this specific thing and you are the person driving this specific thing. And that lets us place 2 bets at once. But the more individual work streams you build out, the harder it becomes to establish that context swap and to align around architecture. And so the harder the conversation comes when you need to tap someone on the shoulder and ask for review, right? Because there is a lot of context switching going on there. And one of the weird things about XP teams is that there's no individual workstream ownership at all, right? You are all working on the same set of things all the time. There's a presumption that everyone's rotating between every piece of work that's happening. And so everyone is required to have complete context on the whole code base, more or less. And it's hard, but it does work.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love it. It's also just like human. Do you know what I mean? Like I didn't join a team so I could go do my thing off on the side, right? It's like, I think that especially, I mean, if we're talking about pretty remote world overall in terms of how we work, a lot of async, right? Like that is further and further driving the kind of disconnects in human connection. That feels like there was too many words there, but it's driving us further apart. Yeah. And just as fundamentally as humans, even engineers who love to be introverted and put their headset on and sort of like tuck away from everybody else, I don't know. I just think like we crave that as humans. And the more that like, if we can use that to be effective at work, more so. We also crave it humans. I mean, we have dopamine receptors, right? Like we like to get stuff done. Yeah. And waiting for someone else for 2 days so that you can do the thing that you thought you were already done, like is fundamentally frustrating, I think, to most people. Well, speaking of humans, I'm sure going to try to make a slightly unawkward segue into something totally different and then declare it, making it as awkward as possible. But at CircleCI, we've been super excited lately, sort of celebrating what it is to be an engineer, the things that drive us and motivate us and get us excited about the work that we do every day. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in on that and tell us a little bit about when you first knew that you were an engineer. Oh, gosh. Well, I am, again, old enough to remember when whether we were considered software engineers or not is a controversial topic. But I can go back a little bit. So I've always been involved in computers sometime. I've loved computers since I was a little kid, but I didn't always know what kinds of computer stuff I wanted to do. So when I was in high school, I used to fix PCs, and then I thought maybe I would go into IT and be an administrator of some kind or whatever. But and so one of my first jobs was I worked in internal tech support, right? So I was part of the IT staff at a firm, and if your laptop broke, you'd hand it to us and we'd turn it around. And huge shout out to folks who do that work, right? It's actually very customer support oriented role. It requires a lot of fiddly technical knowledge. But I enjoyed it. But what I discovered almost immediately is that it involved a lot of
fixing other people's broken software. And I decided that I wanted to be the person creating the broken software. Like if there were going to be bugs involved, I wanted to be on the authoring side of the bugs rather than the person living downstream from them and trying to work my way through them. And I feel blessed in a way because it was a pretty sharp realization for me, actually. Like it sounds funny to say, but like you could tell that was, at least for me, the joy of creating. Like I try to be funny with the bugs, but there's a really qualitative difference between making something and being on the receiving end of what is made, right? And I love the act of creation. I love the joy of making things. To write software is really to be involved in the act of bringing something to life and putting it in front of human beings and seeing how they react to it and growing it in response to what they say, what they like and they don't like. To me, that's one of the great joys of what we do, is being able to build a relationship with people and then finding a way to improve their lives. And so I initially didn't go to college. I spent a little bit of time after high school bumming around and working in IT and trying to figure out what I wanted to do. But that really gave me the motivation to go back and apply to university and get a proper computer science degree. And I never wavered from that afterwards, right? I graduated and went to go work at ThoughtWorks, and I feel so thankful that I've been able to build a career out of it. I mean, look, software has its frustrations as well, Lord knows, but it's when it's great, it's really phenomenal. And especially to our point, when you can move fast and get something out in front of folks and see that spark in their eyes. Even, when I was a founder, right, one of my favorite things to do was to just hear people complain. I love it when people complain about your software because it feels so actionable. It makes me want to turn around and just fix the thing and get that sense of connection to your customers and your users. So yeah, that was it for me. It was working in IT and being immersed in computers, loving the idea of working in them, but knowing that I wanted to be on the side of creating novel things in that space.
I love that. I think that kind of evolution of, I got a little bit of exposure to something and then I realized more things were possible, and I got exposure to that. Like, I have a kid who's a freshman in college, right? So I'm sort of at that, like, and another one who's coming up on that, and this demand you need to figure out what you're going to do with your life that I think a lot of people feel pressure for, but that just, that growth of just, I'm exposing myself, I'm seeing things, I'm learning things, I'm curious. Like, I think curiosity comes up a lot when we talk about, people who love what we do. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. And thanks again for joining me. Thanks to all our listeners. If there's someone that you want us to interview, something you want us to talk about, you could find me on LinkedIn, hit us up on, oh my gosh, our outro script still says Twitter. Yeah. On the thing formerly known as Twitter at CircleCI. Maybe find us on Blue Sky. We're CircleCI everywhere. Find us in your location of choice. If you love the podcast, subscribe to your podcast provider of choice. Brian, thank you again for joining me. As enlightening as I anticipated, it's been awesome to have you.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's been an absolute pleasure.